I used to think absence was passive, that it happened slowly, gently, like a tide retreating, but sometimes absence is deliberate, intentional, like a door closing softly, then locking from the other side. The photo didn't show up right away. It was buried under tagged posts, filtered smiles, a caption that read, "Where everything begins, family." Grace always knew how to make it sound noble. I clicked on it without hesitation, a reflex like touching the edge of something you already know will cut. They were all there. My father in his dark blazer, one hand resting on the back of my mother's chair. Marjorie wore pearls I hadn't seen since the embassy dinner in '09. Grace stood at the center, her arm linked through someone's, probably one of the Whitman Foundation donors. The lighting was soft, intentional, the place settings immaculate, and there was a chair at the head of the table, unoccupied. It had always been mine. I scrolled through the tagged names. Grace had listed them carefully like an RSVP roll call. Each cousin, each spouse, each strategic guest. My name wasn't among them. Neither was my face. There was a framed photo at the center of the table, one of the 4 of us in Maine years ago. The image had been cropped. I knew because I remembered the original Grace on my left, Marjorie on my right, and my hand barely visible on Grace's shoulder. In this version, the frame ended at her wrist. My hand was gone. The silence inside my apartment thickened. The heater clicked. A plane passed overhead. Still nothing drowned the pressure building between my lungs. I clicked over to email. It had been flagged 3 weeks ago. Subject line, title transfer, Clayridge. I had ignored it. Too many forms look the same when they start with per request. It was a brief note. Legal. Detached. As part of the Whitman family restructuring, the Clayridge property has been formally transferred to Ms. Grace Whitman, effective retroactively to April 14th. No further action required. Clayridge. I remembered every corner, the scar on the hallway paint where I dropped my gear bag after the Sudan deployment, the dent in the laundry room door from that winter storm blackout, the ring stain on the kitchen shelf from the tin cup I kept my medals in. I had bought that condo at 28, put Marjorie on the deed because it made things simpler when I was overseas. Grace hadn't even lived there. Not once. There was no explanation, no CC. Just a line at the bottom from our family's law firm signed off without comment. I checked the attachment. The document bore my name, but not my signature. I didn't pick up the phone. There wasn't a call to make. I didn't want clarification. I wanted proof of what I already knew. Instead, I walked to the closet, pulled out the field coat I hadn't worn since Niger. The zipper stuck halfway up. The stitching near the cuff had come loose, revealing a thread of faded camouflage. I left it that way. Outside on the balcony, the wind cut sharp. I stood there long enough to let the weight of the coat settle back into me. On the railing, an old tag was still clipped, Hayes R. 308th Tactical Command. They never used my name when it counted. Once at a fundraiser, someone asked Grace what I did. She answered without pause. She's still in the army. Some logistics thing. I forget which base. I was in Aleppo at the time, helping evacuate field hospitals under mortar fire. Logistics, apparently. The Clayridge file remained open on my screen. My mother's handwriting flickered in memory, cursive on manila envelopes, notes on the backs of Christmas cards, sharp, neat, unforgiving. Bring salad tongs, not the steel ones. Or don't forget to wear heels. You're already taller than your cousins. Frank never wrote. He delegated. Make sure Rowan knows the dress code he once told Grace before a board gala. He knew I didn't need reminders. He just didn't want to tell me himself. I once thought staying quiet was survival, that if I didn't raise my voice, they'd make room for me, that loyalty would be met with belonging. I followed every rule they never said out loud. Now their silence was louder than anything I could have prepared for. There wasn't a warning, no message, no explanation, just absence. Intentional, surgical. On the windowsill, a mug from my first deployment sat chipped near the handle. I hadn't touched it in months. I turned it over once. The base was cracked, hairline clean. A break so fine you wouldn't see it unless you knew where to look. Inside the room was still. On the table, the legal file remained open. The frame around the photo on Grace's post burned in my head. My absence framed as symmetry, as if the photo was always meant to end where I began. I didn't close the browser. I didn't call anyone. I didn't scream. I put the coat back on its hook, leaving the zipper half open. I turned off the lights, one by one. Then I sat. Some things don't need to be answered. Some things only need to be recognized. I learned early how to stay quiet without vanishing, how to move through a room without causing it to ripple, how to fold corners of myself in like a paper map no one needed to read. The mug in my hand was chipped, white ceramic Navy seal faded to ghost blue. I kept wrapping my fingers around the break, as if touch might make it whole again. The handle was too small for my hand, but I never changed it. It had survived more moves than most people in my life. There was a time I mailed letters home every Sunday, neatly folded pages dated top right, signed with care. The stamps were always US flags, chosen deliberately. I believed routines could build bridges, that consistency could be mistaken for presence. No one wrote back. Not once. I told myself they must have gotten lost, or maybe Grace read them out loud and forgot to mention, or maybe Marjorie kept them in a drawer somewhere tied with ribbon, like proof of motherhood. The kind strangers admire, but never verify. I remember the party after the blast. I was still walking stiff then, left side dragging slightly. The scar under my collarbone was too raw for anything but linen. I stood in the mirror for 20 minutes, trying to pin my hair to cover the thinning patch above my temple. Then I pulled on the dress Grace said would soften the uniform edge. It scratched at my waist like reproach. Marjorie raised an eyebrow when I walked in. "At least you didn't wear boots this time." She didn't mention the limp, didn't ask if I'd gotten the glass out, just poured white wine and handed me a glass that was already full. I smiled, took it in both hands so she wouldn't notice the tremor. Frank nodded from the end of the table. "You've been quiet, even for you." I answered something neutral. I always did. He preferred it that way. The award ceremony came later, year 30. I almost didn't invite them. But someone in command said families should see the weight their children carry. I wrote Grace instead. She called back late. Her voice was tight. "Dad's calendar's packed. They're in Geneva that week." I didn't ask what for. She added, "He said you'd understand." I did. When the photo from that ceremony came out, I cropped it myself. No one else was in it anyway. Just me holding the plaque eyes already turning away from the flash. There was another time, more recent, when Grace published her book, a memoir about international policy and being raised in a household that believed in public service. I sent orchids, quiet ones, pale green. She thanked me a week later through a message forwarded by her assistant. "Ms. Whitman appreciates your gesture." I read it twice. The name felt unfamiliar in her mouth. I also made a donation. It was small, unannounced. To the scholarship fund she named after our grandmother, the only one who ever called me her girl. I used a pseudonym. I didn't want it to be performative. Grace mentioned the fund at a panel once. Our family has always believed in paying forward what we're given. I watched from the back row. No one turned to look at me. There was a day I found Marjorie rearranging the shelf above the fireplace. She had removed a small black box, the one with my campaign pin and commendation. She was dusting around it. "Oh," she said, not turning. "That's better in storage. It doesn't match the new frame." It was a print of Grace with a diplomat, their hands clasped over a document, smiling for the press. The light caught on her necklace, a simple pearl strand. I had sent it 2 birthdays ago. She never acknowledged it. I didn't take the box back. I just nodded and stepped around her, careful not to brush the edge of the new glass. There was a rhythm to these moments, a cadence, not cruelty, just omission, a steady erasure done with polished hands and practiced breath. Once in a meeting room just off base, someone asked me about my family. "Your sister's the one in global finance, right?" I nodded. He kept going. "Impressive! Must have been a competitive household." I told him we were raised to serve differently. He laughed. "You got the uniform, she got the microphone. It wasn't a complaint, just a fact." I remember thinking once that if I followed every rule, if I kept my head down, my posture clean, my reputation intact, then eventually they'd let me back in. Not with celebration, but with recognition. The quiet kind. The kind that lives in glances and place settings and framed photographs left unedited. I kept showing up, not to prove a point, but to belong, even peripherally. Belonging, it turns out, isn't always given. Sometimes it's withheld, like a withheld breath held, until you stop asking. I turned the chipped mug slowly, letting the crack catch the morning light. It didn't widen. It didn't heal. It simply remained. That, too, was a kind of truth. I never quite learned how to throw things away. I kept envelopes with postmarks, smudged notes, scribbled in margins, receipts, with nothing left to prove. Not because they mattered, but because someone once wrote on them like I did. The bottom drawer in the hallway was stiff. I had to lean into it, let the wood complain, then stop. Inside were the quiet things, cards I hadn't looked at in years, a few faded photographs and a school yearbook with Grace's name embossed in silver. Senior year. She wrote in every blank corner, to classmates, to herself. Nothing for me. The Christmas card was near the top. Marjorie liked matte finishes. She always ordered the folded kind with scalloped edges and a scented photo on the front. That year, it was her Frank Grace and the dog they adopted after I left for Afghanistan. Matching sweaters, fire in the background. The caption read, "Still together always." Inside was blank. No note, just the pre-printed names spelled out like an equation with no remainder. I turned the card over, checked the bottom corner. Her signature used to loop at the M. Now it was tighter, quicker. My name wasn't there. The photograph from my officer graduation came loose from an old folder. The corners were bent, the gloss fading. I stood alone in dress blues, hat in hand, smile rehearsed. I had sent them 3 invitations, printed, formal. One went unacknowledged, one returned unopened, and the third arrived back with a note from Grace clipped to the corner. "She says the travel's too hard this time of year. You know how winter affects her mood." That was the entire explanation, folded like a permission slip. I still remember standing outside the auditorium, watching other families lean into each other's shoulders. A man next to me took 3 photos with his daughter before they even reached the stairs. Frank had once told me, "Not every victory needs an audience." I nodded then. I believed he meant something noble. Maybe he just meant mine didn't. When Grace got the offer from the World Bank, Marjorie organized a dinner 2 days later. Everyone was there. I sent white lilies with a handwritten card tucked between the stems. It wasn't signed. I thought she would know. The next time I visited their house, the flowers were in a different vase on the back porch. The card was gone. Nobody mentioned them. I asked once lightly if the lilies had arrived. Grace was adjusting her scarf, didn't look up. Oh. I thought those were from Father's office. That was the end of it. The award ceremony at 31 wasn't meant to be public, but they insisted on a short speech. I kept it simple. A thank you. A line about duty. At the end, I turned toward the rows of seats reserved for family. Frank was mid-conversation with a trade advisor, laughing, not loud, just enough that I knew it was real. He didn't look up. After I mailed them a copy of the citation, folded flat between parchment paper, it came back unopened, taped at the edges. No note. The medal stayed in my bag for weeks. When I finally set it on the shelf near the fireplace, I didn't frame it, just placed it gently on the wood, beside a jar of matches and an old book of field maps. The next time Marjorie visited, she moved it. Subtle, turned it toward the wall like it had offended the symmetry. She didn't mention it. She complimented the drapes. There were other things small and sharp. A voicemail from Frank on my birthday. Keep your expectations practical. You're not 25 anymore. Grace's book launch, an invitation with the RSVP line already crossed out in blue ink. The handwriting wasn't hers. A conversation over brunch when someone asked what I did. Marjorie answered Rowan's still involved in defense. Mostly background work. That's what she called a tour in Mosul. Background work. She adjusted her napkin after smoothing the crease twice. I used to imagine that forgetting was an accident, that they meant to include me, that the oversight was a matter of logistics, not choice. But it wasn't the missing invitations or the empty seats. It was the way they spoke around me, the way they reworded history to fit into dinner parties and boardroom pleasantries, the way they looked surprised when I did show up as if I'd interrupted a photo that had already been taken. It's easy to vanish when no one marks the space you left behind. I turned the photograph face down. The drawer didn't close all the way. Some part of me had always hoped to be remembered. Quietly, without applause, just enough to be placed back into the frame. But now I understood. They hadn't forgotten me. They had edited me out. I didn't know there was a threshold until they stepped over it. The message came flagged, not from my unit, not from a superior, but from someone who used to share rations and shelter with me when sand filled our lungs and names didn't matter. Mark's subject line was blank, just a file attached and 2 words typed in lowercase, "You'll want this." I opened it without hesitation. Not from trust. From muscle memory. A line item 750,000, flagged by an internal audit. Origin Defense Fund Joint Operations Budget. Destination Meridian Collective. A civilian consulting firm I'd never heard of, listed under Whitman Strategic Holdings. My name sat in the authorization box. Not a misspelling, not a near match. My full name, in print, signed and sealed. The signature was too perfect. Not one of mine. I stopped using curves in my H years ago after someone forged my leave form, but This signature had them, sweeping, decorative, like someone had practiced it carefully, as if style could cover theft. Beneath it, Legal Guardian F. Whitman. I didn't blink. My fingers curled under the desk edge until they pressed the wood grain into my skin. The form dated back to the spring I was deployed in Djibouti. 9 months of joint training, field repairs, and munitions rerouting. I had signed nothing that entire quarter. Every document was verbal clearance, double recorded, unit confirmed. This wasn't an oversight. The folder was neat, all proper headers, standard format, legal language, pages linked to project codes, each marked approved by primary officer. Hayes R. I'd spent years making sure no decision bore only my name. There was safety in shared accountability. I never wanted to be the kind of officer who disappeared behind red tape. But now, my name had been used precisely because I wasn't there. There was no rage, no panic, just stillness, like a room waiting to echo after a dropped glass that never quite hits the floor. I wrote down 5 lines. Not a complaint, not a defense, just facts, times, and the location of my last confirmed signature. I signed it in pencil. No curves. When I stood, my chair didn't move. My hand left a faint imprint on the desk. I didn't wipe it off. Later that afternoon, I pulled the manila folder from the cabinet marked personal. I hadn't opened it in over a year. Inside were discharge forms, 2 commendations, and a copy of my original power of attorney signed over to Frank when I was 24. A temporary measure, meant to lapse. It never had. There'd been a dinner once years ago when I asked whether the papers had ever been revoked. Grace was swirling her wine. Frank hadn't looked up from his phone. You're still too mobile. It's easier this way. Easier. Not safer, not legal, just convenient. I found the folder from the Whitman Foundation's quarterly statements tucked under an old book of field procedures. A receipt from Meridian Collective sat inside. The same company, the same logo. Their consulting fees had been routed through the family office for 3 years. I circled the date, then paused. The ink bled through. The paper was thinner than it looked. There had been a moment not long ago when I'd sent Grace a link to an article, an anonymous military op-ed about identity breaches in defense contracting. She never replied. Instead, a week later, Marjorie left a voicemail. You really should consider how these stories reflect on the rest of us. I know you think you're raising awareness, but some things are better handled privately. I hadn't called back. They had used my name, my silence, my distance, my rank, all the things I thought I'd kept for myself. There wasn't a confrontation, no shouting, no slammed doors. I didn't draft a statement. I didn't demand answers. I made an appointment. Julia Mackenzie's card was still in my wallet. Thin cardstock, plain black font. No slogan. Just her name and a number no one else had. I didn't call. I wrote a letter. 5 sentences. Direct. I signed it in block letters. Before I sealed the envelope, I added 1 line on the back of the page. I no longer recognize the authority of anyone who uses my absence to claim my name. I didn't underline it. I sat in the same chair for an hour after that. The fan in the ceiling hummed like static. On the edge of the table sat the pen I'd used since OCS. The cap was cracked. I left it off. Frank once told a reporter, "We raised strong daughters. One leads in finance, the other in defense. It's a family tradition of stewardship." I remembered the way he smiled, practiced but soft like pride on cue. He never asked me if I wanted to be managed. That line in the file, Legal Guardian, wasn't about legal standing. It was a statement of claim. as if by being gone I had forfeited the right to guard myself. But I was never unguarded. I was just gone. And that's not the same. There's a kind of silence that doesn't wait to be filled. It doesn't ache, doesn't echo. It simply settles like dust on a frame no one looks at anymore. The house on Clay Ridge still had the same shape, same sloped roof, same black shutters, but the air around it felt thinner. The mailbox had a new nameplate, G. Whitman, in serif gold. There were fresh flower pots near the porch. The curtains inside had changed. The light didn't reach the same way anymore. I didn't knock. I didn't reach for my key. The lock had likely been changed anyway. I stood for a while at the end of the walkway, close enough to smell the mulch, far enough to stay off the motion sensor. The wind moved the top branch of the dogwood tree I had planted. Someone had trimmed it too short. The envelope in my coat pocket had started to soften at the fold. In it were copies of old utility bills, a cancelled mortgage check, and a photograph of the stairwell where I used to leave my boots. Nothing in it held legal value anymore. That wasn't the point. I folded it into quarters again and tucked it behind a library receipt I hadn't returned. I didn't leave it at the door. Back at my desk, I opened the file marked Family Access, Legal Medical. I clicked through each tab. Power of attorney, emergency contact, beneficiary access. One by one I removed my name. Then I removed theirs. The system asked for confirmation. I gave it without comment. That night, Grace sent a message. I heard you were in the area. Should I have expected a visit? I typed a reply. You have full rights to what they gave you. I won't return to reclaim anything. Then I deleted it. Then I typed it again. This time, I hit send. The phone rang 3 times over the next 2 days. The caller ID was private. I didn't answer. One voicemail came through, but I didn't listen to it at first. Later, I transcribed it silently in my head. We assumed you were otherwise occupied. That's what happens when people step away. I changed my banking credentials, redirected my military correspondence to a P.O. box an hour out of town, reformatted the backup drive that once held shared folders labeled with dates and family initials. Nothing in them belonged to me anymore. Maybe they never had. A week later, Marjorie forwarded an email from a media consultant. We'd like to feature Major Hayes in our November spotlight. Her story speaks to resilience and the Whitman legacy of public service. She'd scribbled a note beneath it. This might help repair the image. Just say yes this time. No greeting. No question. Just instruction masked as suggestion. I didn't respond. The envelope for the Foundation's annual dinner arrived a few days later. Embossed crest. Heavy cardstock. My name printed neatly, almost reverently. Grace's signature looped beneath a typed welcome message. I held it under the faucet, let the water smear the ink before dropping it in the trash. Frank's voicemail came at midnight. You're taking this personally. We did what was necessary in your absence. That's how families function. Someone has to stay practical. His tone was measured, not apologetic, not warm, just exact. The silence between his words was more revealing than anything he said. I saved the recording, not for evidence, just so I wouldn't forget the shape of his voice when it carried no room for me. There was another request this time from an internal PR unit, asking if I'd accept a recognition plaque at the upcoming military honors event. It's your story. You deserve it. We'd be honored if you'd let us share it. They followed up 3 times. I didn't reply once. Recognition was never the problem. Visibility was never the goal. What they wanted was presence without personhood. I kept the brass pin from my first deployment in a linen wrap stored in the top drawer beside my bed. It wasn't displayed. It wasn't offered. It remained. Once during a conference years ago, Frank caught me alone in the hallway between sessions. He adjusted his watch and glanced toward the glass doors. "You know you make everything harder than it needs to be. You don't have to perform isolation to feel significant." I didn't answer. That was the last time he called me by name. It took years to understand that not every silence is void. Some are a decision. Some are a final form of authorship. I withdrew, not because they asked me to leave, but because I understood I'd already been erased. The rest was just formality. I didn't slam a door. I didn't raise a claim. I didn't write a letter no one would read. I just stopped arriving. Somewhere along the way I forgot how to wait for noise. I began to prefer things that stayed still. The cabin stood at the edge of a gravel road lined with cedar. I didn't pick it for comfort or charm. I picked it because no one knew it was here. The lease was short-term, the furniture already worn. The man who handed me the key didn't shake my hand. I appreciated that. The place smelled faintly of dry wood and old linen. A narrow bed sat against the wall, tucked in tight beneath a quilt stitched with uneven squares. The desk bore a ring stain at the corner, one drawer stuck halfway holding only 2 pens and an unopened pack of paperclips. No curtains, no internet, just stillness. Unnamed. I boiled water in a dented kettle I had kept from another post, then poured it slowly through a steel filter dented near the rim. The coffee tasted flat. I drank it anyway. There was something reliable about bitterness when everything else became neutral. A notebook rested on the desk, the kind I once used for daily reports. I wrote without headings, without intent. Coordinates, unit names, dates, not full stories. Just fragments of places I'd been, people I'd answered to orders I'd followed. I didn't explain anything. I didn't need to. On the second morning, I found an old envelope tucked inside a field manual. I used it to write a name. No return address, no stamp, just a single sentence folded twice. Some parts of you made it home. I left it in the back of a book I hadn't touched in years. It didn't need to leave to be sent. The days moved with owl rhythm. I woke when the light shifted. The rooster, 2 lots over, crowed off beat. A tractor groaned past the trees sometime after noon. I didn't ask what it carried. I stopped counting days. Nothing asked me to. Breakfast was toast often burned. I didn't scrape the blackened parts. I learned to chew slowly. I fried eggs when the farmhand down the road left a carton by the porch, always without a word. Once there was a note under the flap. "Quiet's a choice most people avoid. Good for you." I didn't reply, but I returned the empty carton. He came back the next week. I swept the front step each evening, not because it needed it, but because the sound of the bristles against stone was a rhythm my body remembered. The rocker on the porch creaked only when I leaned back too far. Sometimes I did it on purpose. I kept a folded shirt from my second deployment in the bottom drawer. The fabric was sun-faded, the collar fraying. I held it against my chest one night, not to wear it, just to remember what it had carried. Grace sent an email. No subject. Just a forwarded press release about a new scholarship program named after our grandfather. I deleted it before reading. There was nothing in it I didn't already know. Marjorie once told me, "You've always been a background person." She said it with a flat tone, as if commenting on wallpaper or dish patterns. Here no one expected anything to match. I ate dinner from a plate that didn't belong to the fork. I drank water from a jar. Nothing shattered. I wrote a second letter, longer than the first. It began. I sleep easier now, even when I don't dream. I addressed it to no one. I folded it tightly and sealed it into an empty tin of mints I'd carried for years. I buried it beneath a loose floorboard, not to hide it, just to give it weight. The radio buzzed once when I turned the dial. Static. A voice, briefly then gone. I left it tuned to the nothing. It filled the air just enough to remind me I wasn't under surveillance. At night, I lit a match, not to see by, but for the ritual of it. The brief flare, the scent of sulfur, the way it consumed itself, without protest. I kept the spent sticks in a glass jar by the window. They weren't useful, but they had burned, and that was enough. Frank once told me, "You never learned how to take a compliment. Makes people uncomfortable." I remembered nodding, not because I agreed, but because that was what made him stop talking. Here, there were no compliments, nothing to deflect, nothing to absorb. The scar beneath my collarbone felt more present in the absence of mirrors. I touched it one morning without thinking. My fingers lingered longer than usual. It wasn't about healing. It was about ownership. I didn't record the days I spent there. I didn't mark the calendar. I didn't track improvement. I just stayed. And for the first time in years, I didn't need anyone to notice that I had. Some invitations arrive already opened. You know what they contain before the envelope touches your hand. The number on my phone wasn't saved, but the pause before her voice gave her away. Grace always paused half a second longer than necessary, like she was preparing to deliver a verdict. There's something that needs your signature. Some old authorization form. It would just be easier if you came to DC. Not a question. Not an apology. Just a task disguised as dialogue. I let the silence stretch until she filled it with her own exit. Later that day, an email arrived from Marjorie. Subject line, Public Unity. It read, "There's a family event at the Financial Leadership Circle. Grace is speaking. They've requested full representation." There was no salutation, no check-in, no hint that we hadn't spoken in 15 months. Then a second line, "I trust you'll dress appropriately for the photos." I stared at the period. Neat. Final. It might as well have been a closing signature. The envelope came by courier heavier than necessary, embossed with the family crest. Inside, Major Rowan Hayes, U.S. Strategic Services Retreat. I hadn't retired. No one had asked if I planned to. They didn't want me to speak. They didn't even want me to stand. They wanted me visible, like a keystone in a structure already falling apart. A friend from my unit forwarded a clipped article, "Whitman Fund under investigation for misuse of internal transfers." Frank was named. Grace was quoted. I wasn't mentioned, but the article noted unexplained omissions in family records. They had remembered me when I became a gap. Another call came. The voice identified herself as a reporter filling in background. "We've noticed your absence from several key Whitman appearances. Can we quote you as unavailable for personal reasons?" She didn't wait for a response. 2 days later, Grace's email arrived. "We've placed a seat in the front row. No speaking required. Just be present." As if presence were a transaction. As if I hadn't already paid for my silence in full. Once at a private fundraiser, Frank turned to me and adjusted his cufflink. "Your value is in what you don't say. You ground the narrative by standing still." I hadn't replied. There wasn't a reply that wouldn't cost something. The press team followed up next. "We believe your appearance would reaffirm cohesion. It would signal resolution." They meant obedience. They meant containment. I poured coffee into a chipped enamel mug and sat with it until it cooled. I remembered the way Marjorie used to lean in at galas whispering through clenched teeth. "You always look like you're bracing. Could you just soften for one photo?" Softness wasn't the problem. I'd just stopped shaping myself to fit into rooms that had already decided my silhouette. The invitation still sat on the table. I flipped it over. On the back, Grace's signature, angled, polished, practiced. I remembered helping her rehearse it once when we were 13. She said it made her feel inevitable. Now it felt like a stamp on a document I never agreed to sign. An automated reminder pinged from the Foundation's office. "Kindly confirm attendance by Thursday. Security clearance will be required at entry. Security for a legacy I was no longer trusted to define." I placed the envelope in a drawer I didn't lock, not because it mattered, but because forgetting it would be cleaner than discarding it. Frank left a message that night. "We've always supported you, but at some point that has to be mutual. You're still part of this, whether you show up or not." It was the kind of threat disguised as inclusion. I let it play once, then again. The second time I wrote down the word mutual on the back of a receipt. I drew a line through it, then tore the paper in half. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that they wouldn't reframe. I sat on the porch with the box of spent matchsticks, slowly turning each one between my fingers. They were small, burnt, no longer useful, but they had carried fire once. I imagined walking into the gala, the camera lights, the polite clapping, the way someone would lean over to whisper, "She's the one who came back." But I hadn't. What returned was only the shape they needed me to occupy, the story they needed me to stabilize. They weren't asking me to come home. They were asking me to fill a blank space without speaking into it. I thought of Grace's voice, calm, curated, detached. "I'm sure we can count on you for this one. Not thank you. Not welcome back. Just count on you like a placeholder, like inventory." The wind shifted across the porch. A leaf landed in my lap, dry and thin. I crushed it gently between my thumb and forefinger. No ceremony, no noise. Just pressure, and then release. Some things stop fitting before you realize you've outgrown them. I started writing by hand again, not to reflect, not to confess, just names. Names of soldiers lost in transfer files, names erased by paperwork. Some I knew, some I only heard once and never forgot. I wrote them in a black leather notebook, with a cracked spine and pages that curled at the corners. The ink pooled in the letters that mattered most. My mornings started early, but not from alarms, just light filtering in, and the quiet weight of a day not yet demanded. I walked to the back room of the academy's annex where I taught part-time. The windows didn't open all the way, and the radiator hissed in winter, but no one minded. 8 cadets, mostly women, eager without trying to impress. One wore her father's dog tags under her uniform. She thought I didn't notice. They asked thoughtful questions, real ones, about chain of command, about the margin between rules and instinct. I didn't answer all of them. Some I let echo longer than they were used to. That silence was the answer. A few weeks ago, one of them left a folded scrap of paper under my notebook. "You make this feel like it matters." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. In the afternoons I worked in the patch of dirt behind my unit quarters. I planted native grass, low flowering shrubs, nothing fancy. Things that could grow without permission. The soil resisted at first, then softened. I stopped tracking progress. The green would come when it was ready. My signature on the internal system changed. I removed the last name. Just 2 letters now. No announcement, no justification. It felt clean. No one asked. I received an email from a communications firm. Glossy website. Big names in their portfolio. We'd love to restore your public image. You deserve your narrative back. They attached a sample media plan. My face next to soft headlines, the major who chose integrity. They didn't want the truth. They wanted redemption framed in neutral tones. I deleted it without replying. Marjorie used to say, "You make things harder than they need to be." Once she handed me a press release she'd edited herself. People need you to be a symbol, not a story. I folded it in half and placed it under a glass of water. Let it warp. I hadn't opened any message signed Whitman in months. If it needed that name to reach me, it probably wasn't meant for me. In the drawer beneath my desk, I kept 3 things: a compass cracked through the middle, a coin from a NATO exchange, and a ceramic mug with the unit crest mostly rubbed away. The handle had broken and been glued twice. It still held. I never used it. I just needed to know it was there. One evening I walked past a former cadet in full uniform. We locked eyes. She didn't blink. "You probably don't remember me," she said. I waited. "You saved someone. Me. Back then." She didn't elaborate. I didn't need her to. Her salute was crisp. She didn't look for my reaction. She just moved on like a truth returned to where it belonged. I sat outside that night with a journal on my lap, and no words on the page. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I finally understood that silence wasn't absence. It was presence, unrequested. Grace sent a brief message. "Foundation Legacy Division is being retired. Your name already removed. No greeting, no punctuation, only conclusion." Frank had once told me, "You're too principled to be practical." Then he turned back to a guest who didn't know my name. He was right, in part. Principle had cost me access, but it had bought me clarity. A local paper asked for a quote for their Veterans Week profile. I typed, "Service is what you keep showing up for, even when no one puts your name on it." Then I closed the email, left it in drafts. Some things don't need a headline. On Saturdays I joined a small peer group. No uniforms, no introductions. Just veterans who understood without talking too much. We played cards. Someone brought coffee in a thermos with chipped enamel. We didn't discuss rank. One day a new face asked, "So what do you do now?" I looked at the dirt under my nails, at the ink on my fingers, at the untouched medal still buried in a drawer I didn't open anymore. "Mostly I keep things alive." She nodded. Like that made sense. Somewhere along the way I had stopped seeking approval and started tending to what remained. Legacy, they once told me, is about what you leave behind. I don't believe that anymore. Legacy is what you refuse to hand over. Some things don't need to be burned to be left behind. They only need to stop being carried. I walked into the bank without my old badge, without the envelope of notarized documents that had once followed me like a shadow. The woman behind the counter smiled without recognition. It helped. I handed over the card. The magnetic strip had long faded. "This account is no longer in use." She nodded, fingers tapping without question. The account had been tied to a shared fund initially framed as a trust, later repackaged as a family arrangement. The last deposit dated back 3 years. No withdrawals since. It had been waiting for closure. I didn't owe anyone but myself. Would you like to transfer the remaining funds? No. Close it. Fully. She stamped a receipt in blue ink, closed by request of account holder. The sound of the stamp hitting the desk startled me more than it should have. I folded the slip and placed it in my pocket, though I already knew I wouldn't need to look at it again. That night I wrote to the family attorney. Typed it clean, no letterhead, no greeting. I formally renounce any and all claims to property, financial interest, or inheritance connected to Frank Whitman or his estate. This decision is neither emotional nor negotiable. I seek no confirmation, no discussion, no extension. Please file accordingly. This is not a protest. It is a conclusion. I signed only my initials. RH. The pen paused for a second too long on the final letter. I mailed one copy. The other I folded and placed in the back cover of my notebook behind bombs and dates and fragments of old reports that no longer meant anything to anyone but me. A few days later, I stood in line outside the county administrative building. The air smelled of ink and coffee. The people in front of me talked quietly, scanning phones. No one noticed the form in my hand. Request for legal name change. I filled it out in neat print. First name. Rowan, last name, Hayes. No middle name, no suffix, just the truth of what remained. Hayes came from my grandmother. She once handed me a pack of seeds when I was 9 and said, "Grow what makes sense to you. Even weeds have roots." She died without much ceremony, but I never forgot how she spoke to me like I didn't need fixing. At the next counter, the clerk asked for identification, then confirmed spelling. I signed 3 times, pressed both thumbs to a digital pad, and waited. Your new name is now recognized by the Commonwealth of Virginia. Her voice was neutral. Practiced, kind but uninvested. It was perfect. The paper they handed me wasn't thick, but it felt heavier than I expected. It didn't weigh down my hand. It steadied it. On the way out, a boy ran past the contents of his binder spilling across the steps like leaves. I crouched down, picked up a sheet with stick figures drawn in the margins. He looked up, flushed, breathless. Thanks. Are you police or something? I handed the paper back. No. Just someone starting over. He grinned, nodded like he understood more than he should have, and ran off without waiting for more. I stood there longer than necessary, the form pressed to my side like a passport. Frank once said during a private lunch something I hadn't asked to attend. Real loyalty is quiet. It doesn't need to be included to be consistent. He poured water into my glass and straightened the table setting, as if symmetry could disguise exclusion. I didn't speak. I just moved the fork half an inch left before the meal began. Marjorie once corrected my tone at a charity event. You make people tense when you sound certain. Try adding maybe to your answers. I tried it once, then stopped. I've never been good at dilution. Grace once messaged the family name only works if we all wear it. She was right. That's why I took it off. Legacy isn't a gift. It's a contract. And I never signed mine. I didn't post about the change. I didn't text anyone. I didn't check for updates from the foundation. They had released a public report last month, and I skimmed only the first page. My name was gone. That was enough. I kept the court slip in my wallet for a week, then placed it in the drawer beside my desk next to the compass with the broken hinge and a dried stem from the first plant I managed to keep alive out back. Not displayed, not hidden, just there. Some things are let go not with force, but with precision. Some mornings don't begin. They arrive in stillness, waiting to be noticed, not announced. The kettle began its slow hiss on the stove top. I didn't rush it. Heat moves the way grief does quietly, without asking if you're ready. The pot I used had a faint chip on its base, barely visible unless held a certain way. I bought it in a corner market in Morocco, back when I believed you could bring peace home if you wrapped it carefully enough. The tea leaves were from a shop 5 miles down a dirt road. The woman who owned it gave no receipts, just asked how strong I liked things, and nodded like she already knew the answer. I liked my tea slow. I liked that it required attention, not perfection. Steam curled upward into the morning air, brushing against the window like breath on glass. I poured it into the clay pot, one crack near the handle, darkened over time. It hadn't broken. It just carried its wound without splintering. No email pinged. No meeting reminder buzzed. No digital trace pulled me away. The only screen in the room was turned face down. I hadn't touched it in 3 days. I hadn't missed it. The table was bare except for a notebook. I'd written 5 names in pencil each, with a memory that didn't ask for confirmation. I hadn't added rank or titles. I'd removed those. Cadet Farris' steady hands in storms. She pretended not to notice. Private Layton always the last to leave, the first to notice absence. Sergeant Vega wore loss like a bracelet, quiet, present, unpolished. Corporal Yoon whistled when the lights went out, but never when they came back. Second Lieutenant Rames said little, listened fully, always remembered. I didn't write for archive. I wrote for stillness, for the shape memory takes when it's no longer for anyone else. Beside the notebook, the wooden box remained shut. No lock, no hinges, just a lid that knew how to rest without being forced closed. Inside one silver star, a ribbon no longer vivid, and a letter whose folds had folds of their own. The edges curled like someone had held it too tightly. He wrote it on a Tuesday, his handwriting careful, but tired. He'd talked about how the desert made everything feel suspended, how silence was the only thing that came on time. He closed with, "You make silence breathable." That's harder than command. I hadn't replied then. I wouldn't know how to now. The uniform still hung in the back of the closet. I hadn't worn it in over a year. The name tag had begun to curl at the corners. It didn't call to me, not because I was finished with it, but because I no longer needed it to justify my place in a room. Once after a field operation gone sideways, Marjorie said over the phone, "Well, at least you can add it to your list." She meant accolades. I heard erasure. Frank, on another call I hadn't initiated, told me visibility is earned, not owed. Be grateful you're in the ledger at all. The ledger didn't hold what mattered. I stepped outside and swept the porch. The broom lost more straw than it gathered. I let the wind finish what I didn't. The porch creaked soft as breath. A boy passed on a bicycle too tall for him, backpack flapping. He didn't wave. I didn't either, but he looked at me like he knew I was exactly where I belonged. I opened the drawer by the window. Inside 2 thumbtacks, a pencil worn down to a stub, and a blank square of thick paper. I wrote, "Someone was here." No punctuation, no date, no signature. I pinned it to the inside of the cabin door. Not for memory, not for monument, just for presence. Later, I returned to the table. The sunlight had shifted, landing differently on the notebook. I added a 6th name. Instructor stayed long enough to remember. I thought about the day I decided not to return to Clayridge. The legal office had asked if I wanted to update my next of kin. I told them not yet. I didn't explain. Legacy is not about what they call you after. It's about what you leave untouched. The small cactus on the windowsill had begun to tilt. I rotated the pot. not to correct it, but to help it find light more easily. The drawer with the medals remained closed. I hadn't opened it since spring. I didn't forget them. I just didn't use them to define the shape of today. At dusk, I walked down to the creek bed. The rocks were damp, uneven, cool. I sat without intention. A bird called once, then went quiet. I remembered a moment long ago when someone asked me what I'd do if I wasn't needed. Back then, I didn't have an answer. Now, I did. I would wake. I would brew. I would write names not meant for history books. I would let light fall on pages. I would sit and not apologize for it. A breeze caught the edge of the paper on the wall. The note fluttered on slightly. That was enough. No post went up that night. No proof of life, no explanation of peace. Just the low hum of a room with no tasks attached to it. Grace hadn't written in months. Her last message asked, "Will you reconsider? We could restore your place. There was nothing to restore. Place is not something that can be given." Frank's name surfaced once on a search result I didn't click. He'd always said the ones who walk away make the best cautionary tales. Let them tell it. I pressed my thumb to the last page of the notebook. Let the oil from my skin leave a mark. Not deliberate, just human. Then I closed the book. Not because the story ended, but because the silence knew how to hold what mattered. I didn't go to the ceremony. I didn't send a note. I didn't write a speech about identity or independence. I didn't give them a clean ending, because I had already given myself something better. A morning that arrived not with fanfare, but with light through clean windows, a kettle that hummed without command, a name spoken only when needed and not by everyone. I no longer lived in protest. I no longer searched for proof. I no longer asked to be included. I no longer shrank to fit. I lived fully, quietly, irrevocably, and that finally was enough.